Siguiendo con el orden de esta tarde, nuestra siguiente conferencia o exposición se denomina Logística Internacional Post-Pandemia, Análisis de la industria aérea y la de transporte marítimo de contenedores. Nuestro expositor será Richard Brigth.
Muy bien. Muy buenas tardes. Mi nombre es Richard. Es una de las publicaciones. Quisiera agradecer a EBE por la oportunidad de estar aquí con ustedes hoy. Es una de las convenciones más grandes del mundo. Lo que sucede en Ecuador resuena alrededor del mundo. Y AEBE es uno de los puntos más importantes y las conferencias más importantes en el mundo. Hoy hablaré acerca de mercados, contenedores y también las cosas que han sucedido este año. Hablar de los impactos en los mercados regionales y también de lo que veremos en los meses a venir. También en impacto y lo que esto tendrá, el impacto de las crisis también en la industria bananera. Es un punto muy importante en la cadena de valor. Es la variable más importante en la cadena de valor y en las negociaciones y en los programas del año 2021. Será el elemento más crítico de acuerdo a nuestros cálculos. La crisis nos tomó a todos por sorpresa. No teníamos los equipos adecuados, la cantidad de contenedores apropiada, y eso hizo que el costo del cargo y de los contenedores suba. Esta crisis también creó un efecto colateral en los operarios. Ha llevado a que la empresa de cargos se desespere, que tratemos de encontrar contenedores en cualquier lugar, sabiendo que hay más competencia y más costos, y debido a que necesitamos que los buques estén en el lugar debido a la hora debida. El costo llegó a ser algo de menor importancia por la necesidad de transportar las cosas. Los costos promedios entonces subieron, especialmente para el transporte especializado, rompiendo todos los récords anteriores. Entre febrero y abril, vimos que la capacidad se llenó para todo el año. La cantidad, vemos que de buques fue completada rápidamente. A corto plazo, la escasez también nos llevó a que los contenedores también hagan pedidos de mayores equipos. Vamos a la siguiente diapositiva. Muy bien. Aquí podemos ver la cantidad de contenedores que han sido fabricados y la cantidad es la columna cuarta. Aquí indica la cantidad en 2015, más de 17,000 TEUs fabricados, es 135,000, porque los TEUs se debe redondear la cantidad total. Así que en el 2015, 217,000 TEUs fueron fabricados, 135,000 para contenedores. Esta cantidad bajó en el 2016, aumentó en el 2017, de nuevo aumentó en el 18, en el 2019 subió y bajó un poco en el 2020. Pero pueden ver los cambios en el 2021, que fue una respuesta directa a lo que la crisis provocó. Vemos también un efecto en las líneas de suministro de contenedores y también en el stock. Nos pudimos dar cuenta de que se duplicó la demanda comparado con el pasado trimestre en el CNA. Vimos 188.000, lo que fue un récord de unidades de contenedores producidas. ¿Cómo lo estaré explicando? La producción no será afectada por el cargo hasta que hayan más variables y tengamos mejores resultados.
Capacity crunch have nothing whatsoever to do with the supply and demand for reefer capacity, specialized or containerized. Instead, the global shortage of equipment is directly or indirectly related to the coronavirus pandemic. This completely unpredictable variable
Esto fue una variable completamente impredecible que continuará teniendo un efecto en la cadena de valor y en la cadena de suministros, en la oferta y la demanda. Veremos a la perspectiva especializada. Primero,
it is the only true objective measure of the market. And secondly, because it is transparent, we know the total capacity of the reefer fleet, where each vessel is positioned and where it trades. The strength of the market is measured by the time charter equivalent yield. The weekly time charter equivalent average is calculated by taking voyage revenues, subtracting voyage expenses, including canal, bunker, and port costs, and then dividing the total by the round-trip voyage duration in days. It gives shipping companies a tool to measure period-to-period changes. It's not possible to apply the same metrics to containers, although we know how many reefer slots each container vessel has and how many reefer containers each of the carriers operates. The information on the number of reefer containers carried per voyage is not publicly available and cannot therefore be independently verified. We also don't know if the containers are full or whether they're empty. And we also don't know, most importantly, how much cargo is paying. Okay, so this is what happened this year. Up until the end of April, nothing especially remarkable had happened. The supply and demand for specialized reefer capacity was following an established pattern, although there was additional demand, and that was caused by the extra volume of squid in the South Atlantic. Despite the storms that wreaked havoc through the vineyards of central Chile, the number of table grape vessels that sailed to the US East Coast and West Coast were similar to previous years. Banana volumes from Ecuador were lower than in 2020, but the reduction was principally shipments to the Far East and Middle East, and therefore it affected container line services and not really the specialized vessel mode. It was really only in the first week of May when the potential scale of the shortage of reefer equipment started to become evident. More inbound reefer containers were becoming stranded in China, while more outbound boxes were being used as dry vans as demand for Chinese fast-moving consumer goods soared in the United States. It is hard to estimate the true scale of the impact. At best, all we have as independent analysts is anecdotal evidence. Carriers may each individually know how much of their reefer equipment continues to be displaced. But as I mentioned, that information is neither collated independently nor publicly available. The carriers rarely, if ever, give out information on reefer. The market, meanwhile, can deduce there is a shortage only because reefer brokers and or operators are approached by cargo looking for an alternative. To illustrate just how tight the market had become in this period, at one stage, there was even an inquiry for a reefer vessel from Maersk, the world's largest shipper of reefer goods, that was in so much trouble that at one stage it was looking at the possibility of supplementing its capacity with a reefer. Right, we know that there are more reefer containers trading this year than last. And yet there was still a problem. And the reason why reefer cargo in New Zealand and South Africa, the United States, Argentina, Ecuador, and Brazil was and continues to be starved of capacity is that a lot of the available equipment is being employed on non-reefer voyages. That is, they're used for non-reefer purposes, mainly on the trans-Pacific voyages between China and the United States. This is partly because there is a shortage of dry vans, but mainly because dry is generating much higher yields than reefer. So $20,000 for a cargo of dry container from China to the US West Coast compares to $3,500 for a reefer container from between Ecuador and the Eastern Med. You can see very clearly there why the carriers are doing what they're doing. They're just following the money. On a micro scale, the supply of containerized reefer cargo is dependent upon the carriers positioning containers to meet demand. Historically, there have always been enough reefer containers for carriers to reposition on ghost ships if there is a discrepancy between supply and demand. However, on this occasion, this year, and for reasons beyond their control, the carriers can legitimately claim they weren't able to project the shortfall with any degree of accuracy or certainty. Now, this is where it gets a little bit complicated, if it's not already. The capacity shortage is an issue for both the cargo and the carrier. Firstly, there is no mobility. Reefer cargo that is committed to load on carrier service A cannot easily switch to slots on carrier services B or C because equivalent services may not even exist. It also may be the case that carriers B and C are struggling to source equipment. What generally happens if there is a shortage is that the smaller shippers have no choice. They just cut supply. On the other hand, those with a critical mass of cargo, the big boys, can step away from the carriers and charter their own reefer ships. And this is exactly what happened in Brazil for protein, in California with Sunkist and citrus, and in New Zealand with Enza for apples. Now, at the end of October, there continues to be enough equipment out of position or containers being used as non-operating reefers for such cargo to reach out to the reefer. The slightly unusual element in the mix is that it has been dry cargo as much, if not more than reefer cargo that has been making inquiries extraordinarily. This is not surprising. The current rate for a dry van, as I said, on a China to US East Coast voyage continues to make chartering a reefer vessel a viable commercial alternative. In reefer, the container shortage was especially acute in Brazil, where vessels loading frozen poultry every 7 to 10 days instead of containers to destinations all over the world. In South Africa, the early season crisis was sufficiently grave to alert the Citrus Growers Association into recommending a radical reefer new build commissioning program. New Zealand kiwi fruit market Zespri was forced to charter in more reefer tonnage to cover the shortage of equipment available for both its Asian and European markets. Given that the complex variables which conspired to first cause and then exacerbate the capacity crisis for both dry and reefer, they were nearly impossible to forecast. It is equally impossible to predict if and or when these container services will return to normal. This is because it is not just the trans-Pacific trade in goods that is absorbing reefer equipment, it is because of the congestion and bottlenecks at ports in the United States. So we've got another variable that is complicating matters. Until this congestion and the backlog of containers on the US West Coast clears, there is no reason to suggest that the position will change for dry or for reefer. In early October, for example, Los Angeles had nearly 500,000 TEUs, or about 12 million tons of goods, waiting in drift areas and at anchor for berths to open up along the port to dock and unload. The port had 19 mega container ships waiting to dock, the largest of which was carrying 16,000 TEUs on its own. The ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach had 90 container ships, 63 of which were waiting offshore, a number far above the port's pre-pandemic average of 0 to 1 ships at anchor. That compares more than 90 to none, basically. One vessel from Asia had been waiting off the coast for almost a month. There are associated complicating factors that will prevent a return to normal. These are many warehouses on the west coast of the United States don't have any capacity. About 98% of warehouses in Southern California's logistics-heavy Inland Empire region is fully occupied, while the entire Western US has a virtual zero vacancy rate. The backlog has not only caused a shortage of containers, but also the chassis needed to haul them. Today, containers are being stacked in residential areas near the port. Port executives have warned that the shipping crisis may well continue into 2023. If this is the case, reefer capacity, both specialized and containerized, will be constrained for a minimum 15 months and most likely longer. Theoretically, the step increase in the manufacture of dry and reefer containers in China will help alleviate the shortage, but this alone will not solve the gridlock of COVID-caused or COVID-related port congestion along the chain. So, what will 2022 bring, and what does this mean for bananas? Well, preliminary indications are that the supply of total reefer capacity will remain limited. On the specialized side of the equation, tonnage will certainly be tight for the first 6 months of the year. More tonnage will be needed for the seasonal contracts and regular liner businesses, which means that there will be fewer vessels available for spot banana cargoes, as is the case just now. So when vessels do become available, they will be expensive, as they are now. Meanwhile, most banana cargo on liner services, both specialized and containerized, will know by now what to expect in terms of rate increases. I would imagine that there's a fair bit of negotiation going on at the conference today and tomorrow. Just how tight the market is and to what extent rates rise depends also on the global availability of reefer containers. As this year has clearly demonstrated, the variables that govern the market for reefer containers are very different from the factors that influence the specialized mode. If COVID continues to disrupt port operations in China and in the United States, and if the carriers continue to prioritize profit over service, cargo and charterers can expect more of the same. In other words, if the supply of reefer equipment remains deployed in better paying dry cargo trades, there won't be any more capacity for those trades that the carriers have had to sacrifice this year. In the longer term, of course, supply will normalize and equilibrium will be reestablished. How long this will take is contingent on factors and variables that are completely unrelated to the demand for reefer capacity. This is what makes forecasting so difficult. Whether this means that containerized reefer rates will revert to the levels of the past decade is a question that delegates will need to ask carriers. And according to Banano figures, 26% of total banana exports from Ecuador container line MSC has the largest share of banana exports. I've got that here? No. As far as the specialized reefer is concerned, cargo has every reason to worry. The mode is already living on borrowed time. The average age of the fleet, as you can see in front of you, is 28 years. This is 2 years more than the accepted lifespan of 26 years. What's worse is that there are no new build vessels on the order book. Every 5 years, reefer ships have a special survey. Ship owners have to make a decision on whether to invest approximately $1 million per ship to ensure that the vessel maintains its class. In other words, it's seaworthy. With the price of steel on the Indian subcontinent near record highs, there is no incentive to spend that much money if the investment cannot be recovered. So if the reefer market remains as strong as it has been for most of this year, cargo will continue to have an alternative to the container lines. If not, reefer vessels will be demolished and that alternative will disappear. The ships will disappear anyway if there are no new builds on order. But this could take as long as 8 to 10 years if the market stays good, or as little as 2 years if the market collapses when all this new equilibrium is reestablished and all this new reefer equipment comes onto the market. Okay, so now I'm going to summarize. The reefer market is subject to a complex set of variables that affect both the supply and the demand for capacity. This year, a brand new variable was introduced into this equation. This variable, COVID, continues to have a profound impact on the supply of capacity, which has led to an unprecedented series of events, none of which could have been forecast. Until things normalize, the market will continue to be difficult to predict. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.